Welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining the first of the Bitesize series. So just as a bit of a preamble, so my name is Conor McCann. I co-lead the junior faculty alongside Amy McDaig, Holly Livermore and Julian Baratu. The junior faculty's kind of main mission is to give kind of junior people within the BRC a voice in the kind of the higher up decisions and strategy. We also offer a number of different kind of funding schemes. So you may have seen the Catalyst Fellowship application going last week. And then we also trying to develop alongside the Career Development Academy a number of different training opportunities such as the Bitesize series. So this is the first of the Bitesize series. There's going to be 6 kind of seminars a year run over a 2-year period initially. And the first one is on EDI, and it's going to be led by Poonam and Jon, who are the EDI coordinator for both ICH and GOSH. And Poonam is the EDI coordinator, and Jon is the lead of the EDI committee within ICH. So.
Yes, so just while we get the slides up, I'll be starting off. We'll probably just be talking a little bit about exactly what we mean by sort of EDI, and then what is sort of talking about kind of cultural competency and how we can kind of improve that within ourselves. And then I'll hand over to Jon, who will talk about kind of the equality impact assessment and go through kind of an example of that. And hoping for it to be interactive. So if you've got questions as well, feel free to put your hand up, and we'll also take some at the end. Yeah, so I've got sort of 4 pictures here, which is of an analogy of kind of a tree and access to that. So what we think of as inequality, probably quite self-explanatory, that there's probably like an unequal access to opportunities. And then we can go on the next. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, yeah. Yes. That's the next one. Yeah. So here we've got kind of a comparison between what we mean by inequality and equality with a question mark. So we've got some evenly distributed tools and assistance, but the outcome necessarily isn't probably what we're looking for, in that it isn't actually equal. So sometimes within this kind of space, we talk about equity. And this is where maybe we have specific kind of tools that can address or I guess identify the area of inequality and then take action to do that. For me, I think I really like this last analogy in this last picture, as I think that's kind of the end goal of what we want from equality, diversity, inclusion. And it's talking about justice, where we not only kind of look at kind of offering the tools and opportunities, but also we fix the system in terms of making sure that there are enough opportunities available to kind of really balance it out. So I'll give you a bit of time just to kind of look at that, just to kind of take that in terms of what we mean by EDI. I think it's a really good sort of analogy. So inclusivity in health and social care research, why is it important? If we kind of consider the sort of effects of underrepresentation, there's a few issues that if we don't necessarily have kind of equal or diverse or inclusive kind of research participants, there's a lot of issues that can occur. So the generalizability of our data, if we're only undertaking research on a particular group of people, and but we want it to be generalizable to the whole population, it doesn't necessarily work. Also, the relevance of our kind of interventions and our services, this can affect people in different ways. So that's really important. And also the way people access their resources and services, that it can also be kind of differently distributed. So I just want to show you this video that was created by UCLH. It's a really useful kind of infographic.
Medical science has a problem. It's missing something. Something that means that not only is it harder to find the causes of some diseases and effective ways to treat them, some diseases are getting overlooked entirely.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. Scroll down and insert.
Thermoscientific Vanquish Core has helped to alleviate our challenges by being
It turns out what it's missing could be you, but I'll get to that in a bit. Because first, a story.
Sorry, everyone. This one. Oh, can you see it?
Or 8 billion stories to be precise. See, our DNA is our body's instruction manual, sure, but it's also a history book that records our own unique genetic story. All our stories begin around 300,000 years ago when humans arose in Africa. Some genetic stories tell of leaving a couple of 100,000 years later, journeying into Europe, East Asia, or the Americas. Some genetic stories speak of expanding empires. Others, the diseases we evolved to ward off, and some, the simple act of settling down, raising cattle, and drinking their milk. Each of our genetic stories are different, but maybe not as different as you might expect. We share 99.9% of our DNA with each other. Our stories are 99.9% identical, but that 0.1% difference is incredibly powerful. In that tiny difference between our genetic stories is where we have the potential to develop better treatments for diseases. Treatments that work for everyone. But medical science isn't currently reading all those stories. To explain, let me tell you how researchers work out the causes of diseases and develop and test the effectiveness and safety of new treatments. To find out the causes of a particular disease, researchers find lots of people who have that condition and comb through their genetic stories. They look for little variations they share, little bits of their DNA stories that are spelt differently. If they find some, then they try all sorts of different ways of dealing with the effect of them. And if that uncovers something that looks promising, they then run a clinical trial to see if it actually is. In phase 1, a small group of volunteers try the treatment. Well, often only half of them do, with the other half getting a placebo that does absolutely nothing. If there aren't any notable side effects at the target dose, the treatment is cleared to move on to the next stage of the clinical trial. Phase 2. This time with a bigger group of participants who all have the condition the researchers hope the drug will treat. If the drug appears effective, it moves on to phase 3, with more participants trying it for even longer. Only after all this is the new treatment then reviewed and, hopefully, approved for use by us, the general population. But there's a problem with it. Here is the ethnicity of lots and lots of people used to recently find the causes of various diseases. And here is how that compares to the ethnic diversity of the world's population. Spot the difference? The genetic stories that researchers are combing through are heavily biased to those of people from European descent, which means that if you're searching for those disease-causing bits of DNA to target new drugs against, and you're mainly reading the stories of people of European descent, you might completely overlook key bits in the stories of other diverse groups that tell of, say, a changed risk of disease, or even shed light on how a disease occurs. For example, scientists may not have found the mutation that causes sickle cell disorder if we'd only looked in the stories of people of European descent. And the thing is, what medical science is missing doesn't end there. When new treatments or medical devices are being tested, they need to be tested on everyone that may use them. If the genetic stories involved don't reflect the breadth of stories in our worldwide library, then again, something might be missed. Take, for example, the medicine warfarin, used to prevent blood clots. Researchers have found that to produce the same effect, most people of East Asian descent need a lower dose than some people of European descent, and most people of African ethnicity need a larger dose, which means the dose that works best for someone may vary according to their ethnicity. It's this kind of important information that can be missed if clinical trials don't include people from across a range of ethnicities. So, what's the solution? Well, it's quite simple, in theory. In order to develop treatments that work better for everyone, we need to involve everyone's stories in medical research, in the early stage research, in the drug development process, and right through the clinical trial. The good news is that more and more people are thinking about this. For example, cancer researchers at University College London researching genetic markers for cancer want to analyse tissue samples from a wide range of ethnicities so that the biomarkers of cancer they identify will be relevant for people from as many ethnicities as possible. Bottom line, medical science needs to ensure it's got the best library it can have, the one with the widest collection of genetic stories possible, so that everyone's story can be considered, including yours. That is the only way to ensure everyone, everywhere, can get the best medical treatment they possibly can.
So yeah, clearly a video that was made for kind of a public audience and very specific to kind of looking at ethnicity, but the kind of general gist of the message is obviously that we need to kind of diversify the research that we're doing. Yeah. So the next thing I kind of want to talk about is something called cultural competence. So probably kind of a new area that a lot of people are talking about in kind of the context of research. And what we mean by cultural competence is basically, there's a definition there, but it's basically the fact that all of us have kind of a lens that we look through the world at, and it's maybe understanding that as researchers, we have a lens that we look through and we do research at, but also the people that we're going to be working with have a specific kind of areas that affect them as well. So for example, me, I'm a able-bodied woman of Indian origin, born in the UK. I'm the youngest of 3 siblings. I'm married and I have a university education. All of these things are gonna affect the way that I view the world and the way that I do things in the world generally, obviously also in research. All of you here have different kind of things that have affected you in your life. You have different characteristics that also affect you in the way that you do things. So cultural competency is really about the becoming aware of that, taking sort of, I guess again, improving that sort of self-awareness, having the reflection, but also thinking about the groups that you're working with, and how maybe some of those things can affect them. So the question there, obviously a critical question to ask is, can we ever be completely culturally competent? For me, I think it's, like I said, it's difficult. I think the answer to that is probably no, but it's a journey that we can be on, and we can kind of create kind of greater awareness. There was an example, I think it was by Rennie Edo-Lodge, who's the author of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. She actually started a job which required her to commute by cycling, and she'd use the train station. It was only then that she realized how inaccessible these train stations were to people with wheelchairs, because there were just steps everywhere. And prior to kind of being a cyclist, she didn't think about that because it didn't affect her. And I think it's quite perceptive in that obviously things, like I said, we have this kind of cultural frame of reference, and we have certain things that affect us because we're living our life, and maybe we don't think about how things are affected, how things affect other people that are maybe not so similar to us. So in terms of kind of inclusive study design, how can we sort of improve that? What can we sort of think about? So maybe one of the main things there is sort of thinking about our terminology and language. I guess obviously the obvious thing is always kind of acronyms can be quite difficult for people to understand. The 2 points that I've put there. So we often talk about underrepresented groups, and that there's different ways that maybe we can think about that. Are they actually underrepresented? Are they underserved? Or are they seldom heard? Is the issue with them in that they're not coming forward to do the research, or is it to do with them that we're not being inclusive in terms of including them in our research? So maybe there's a different way that we can frame that and think about that. The second point, specifically to do with kind of race and ethnicity, BAME tends to be quite an outdated term. So it stands for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic. A lot of people are kind of moving away from that and maybe using other kind of terminology. I think it's still a very contentious topic, and we probably haven't agreed on something to use. But some of the others that are kind of out there are people of color, people of global majority, which I think is quite a significant one, again, because we think of them as a minority, but actually when you think of them on a global perspective, they actually make up the majority. And then finally, sort of racially minoritized. Another way to kind of think about it is actually look at specific groups. We maybe think of Asian, but Asian covers so many different perspectives, and actually groups within that are affected in different ways. So you can have South Asian, you can have Bangladeshi, Pakistani, East Asian, Chinese, they're all affected in different ways. They're not a homogenous group. And then secondly, kind of thinking about the diversity of the different stakeholders that are involved in the research. So how diverse is the research team? How diverse is the PPIE group, the advisory group, the steering group? All of these people will bring different perspectives to your research, and it can be really important. Yeah, it's important to sort of think about these things. You can stop there. Yeah. So kind of going forward and sort of linking towards the quality impact assessment in terms of what Jon will be talking about. These are kind of some of the things that we should also be considering within our research. So in terms of the characteristics, these are actually, I think, covered by the Equality Act, and there are 9 protected characteristics. Can any of you name them? Yeah, even. Yeah, gender's one.
Race.
Race. Yeah, anything else?
Age.
Age, yes.
Disability or ability.
Yeah, disability or ability. Anything else?
Socioeconomic status.
That actually isn't one. But that, so Vanessa says socioeconomic status, that is probably covered in the and beyond. It is an important factor, but it isn't actually a protected characteristics. So yeah, click next. This shows some of, so the 9 protected characteristics that are covered by kind of the Equality Act, some maybe that you may not have considered. So these are kind of really important to kind of consider, again, like what Jon will be covering in the equality impact assessment, but there is also some other factors that we should be thinking about, such as socioeconomic status, people with caring responsibilities. Again, this can kind of affect people in different ways, thinking about people's different life experiences. Again, whether they may be kind of a refugee, an asylum seeker, a migrant, that journey would have affected them in certain ways. Some people may just generally have personal preferences when it comes to being involved in research. Language is, again, a huge thing. It's probably something that we would think about, and then geographical location. So these are just some things that we should kind of be thinking about when we do our research. I'll now hand over to Jon, who'll go over the equality impacts.
Do you want to take questions for your part first?
If there are any questions, happy to take them, or we can wait till the end. No?
That's probably the end. I've got a question. Can both answer them.
Okay, thanks, Poonam. So I'm going to talk about equality impact assessments, which are kind of a fairly formal tool that can be used in this context, but I think useful, not necessarily because maybe you'll need to fill in a formal EIA, but more just as a way of thinking. And I'm going to get you to think about this and actually do a little bit of feedback later on, so be prepared for that. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so equality impact assessments are a tool that are designed to help ensure that policies, practices, events and decision-making processes are fair. They're used in various formal contexts by universities and funders, plus governments, including councils and these sorts of things, that they want to think about, okay, we're planning to do X. What are the likely impacts on people with certain protected characteristics or some of the other things that Poonam mentioned, which go beyond the protected characteristics. And the idea is that you are considering in advance how that impact might pan out, whether it might be a positive impact, whether it might be a negative one. And there's increasing interest in applying this to research projects as well. And in some areas, depending on who your funders are and where they are in the grants, in the sort of general shift in this direction, you may be asked to provide some of this kind of thinking, if not in a formal EIA, then at least in some kind of narrative form. So this is an example. Sorry, this is an example of what sort of structure of a EIA usually put in a sort of table form like this. So it's not particularly complicated. You just have a category of protected characteristic group that you're interested in. Thinking about whether there's a potential for positive or negative impact on that group, and then thinking about why you think that might be the case and any evidence that's behind that. And again, this is not necessarily something to be shared outwardly, although it might need to be. but it's a process to go through and to think about, to work through. And then finally, what action, if any, you need to take or might want to take in order to address any potential for negative impact. So the idea is to work through this. So here's one example. This is an example specifically online, so it's not relating to anything in particular that you need to that we're going to focus on. But just for example, disability. What might the impact be? Well, it says potentially negative/positive, so it kind of depends, I guess. And then potential limited access to meetings for those with mobility issues. Okay, this follows relatively straightforwardly. And then, okay, what can we do about this? Well, people can be asked to highlight anything that they think may impact their access to meetings, and then there can be explicit mitigations put in place to do about this. So you may hear, for example, in the workplace about reasonable adjustments, and this is a little bit like this, right? So you are thinking about how can we make adjustments so that there is access for these people to the meetings. And this is a bit like what Poonam was talking about equality versus equity. Equality is everybody can go up the same steps, right? Whereas equity is, if you can't get up steps, then maybe something is done specifically in order to make it easy for you. So this is some guidance that comes from the NIHR. So this is to make it explicit from one of the funders in terms of the things that they want people to think about when they're designing inclusive research. So I will read these out, but won't dwell on them too much. So what are the characteristics / demographics of the population which your research looks to serve? It may be that you don't necessarily need to consider the whole population, because it may be that there are good reasons for it to focus on particular areas, but you need to consider that. How will your criteria, inclusion/exclusion criteria, enable your trial population to match the population that you aim to serve? And this is not only about trials, but this is in the context of this specific. Justify any difference between your trial population and the population you aim to serve. So why is it that there is a mismatch? Is it because of, are the things that are simply insurmountable? Or is it simply that you're going for something which is more convenient? How will you design recruitment and retention in order to engage with underserved groups? What evidence have you got that your intervention is feasible and acceptable to a broad range of patients in the populations that your research seeks to serve? It's slightly long-winded, but you get the point. And are your outcomes validated and relevant to a broad range of patients in the populations that your research seeks to serve? Which is again a slightly long-winded way of saying, are your results likely to generalize effectively, which is again what Poonam is talking about. Okay, so this is an example scenario. So this is a grant application that's being put in. I very much simplified the scenario because you don't need all of the details, but just to give you a little bit of context, I'm going to show the actual equality impact assessment document that was put in. I don't hold that up as a perfect example. This is an example of a sort of a real submission that is made. But what I'd like to do first is to give you a chance to discuss it amongst yourselves and feedback on some things where you think there might be effects that are relevant. So this is the scenario. This is a comparison of approaches to psychological care for children and young people with mental health disorders and long-term physical conditions. And they're interested in how effective they are and how cost-effective they are. It's a collaborative project, so they've had PPI from the start, and they have had input from that who strongly supporting the project. And the idea is that they're going to offer a number of interventions at various NHS sites around the country, and they also offer the ability to offer them remotely. Okay, so I hope that's reasonably clear. Okay, so the questions effectively are, the question is, are the benefits of the project for an individual? This is how I think about it. Are the benefits of the project for an individual likely to depend on their existing status with respect to one of the characteristics? And to remind you, these are the protected characteristics listed here. And I'd also suggest thinking about geographical location and socioeconomic status. And here's a blank version of the table just to prompt your discussion. So what I'm going to suggest is that for those who are online, we will mute the sound in the room so that we can't hear you. But if you're okay to discuss amongst yourselves, I see there are 19 people online, so you're a reasonably big group. But if we can mute you, then hopefully, like within the room, then hopefully you can discuss. And those who are in the room can discuss amongst themselves as well. So we'll allow maybe 10 minutes or so for discussion, and then we'll feed back. Okay, right. Hopefully everything is re-enabled. So if anyone, if in the online, if you can't hear me, please chat. Otherwise, I'm going to assume. I've switched it back on. So does anyone who's online want to say anything, or do you want me to just summarize what's been discussed in the chat? Okay, I'll take the silence to mean that you'd rather me summarize it. Oh. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so there's been some discussion on the chat about some areas that might be relevant. So I'll just briefly summarize that, and then we can add anything that's been discussed in the room, if that's okay. So initially, the group online, we're talking about accents, which is, related to language, of course, and which is one of the areas that that Poonam raised. So access in terms of being able to perhaps understand what it is that they're being asked to do. It could be, as in the recruitment stage, it could be not wanting to be overly complicated in your adverts, let's say, or information sheets, so that people follow what it is that you're asking them to do, or what it is that they're being recruited to. So language barriers of various kinds, and then in person, if people are coming along for an intervention, can they be understood? Can they understand? Can they follow what it is that they're being expected to do in the intervention? So this is a little bit further down the line, but potentially, but it's also relevant to recruitment. And then there is some discussion about socioeconomic status. So travel, maybe there's difficulties around travel. Maybe people lack resources, time and money in terms of travel. You can reimburse people for travel, of course, but you can't reimburse their time. So if they may simply just not have the time, so there may be some disparities there. Digital poverty, so access to IT, for example. So maybe people don't have IT. If they're going to do, otherwise would do the task or the intervention remotely, they might struggle if they don't have the IT available that's needed to do that. Should we, does anyone want to chip in before I add anything else from the online discussion? Anyone want to chip in with something that was discussed in the room?
I guess one thing I wonder is whether it would help having kind of more representation in the PPI groups and making sure that that PPI group represents the population you're trying to capture. If you kind of know it can be hard, because then you might get some insight from that group as to what the barriers might be.
Yeah. So yeah, representative PPI.
Yeah.
So I don't know too many details about the PPI, so I don't know how well balanced the PPI group was, but that's a good point. Anything else that anyone wants to flag up?
I think that the language is a big thing, so making sure that all the kind of, like you said, the initial adverts, but then also all of your study kind of paperwork, kind of information sheets, both for the kid and for the parents, that are all translated into the languages that are in the population that you want to capture.
Sure.
And that you have translators available, or some kind of translating service available and costed within the study.
Yeah, so translation, and we also talked about, you know, effective communication with parents at the time, so making sure that there's exactly interpreters available if necessary. Anything else? Anyone from the back, anything to add? I think we've covered everything else. So of course, this is targeted at people with mental health problems, so that they are the target group. So the intended benefit, the intended effect on that group is positive, right? But there is still, you know, the need to make sure that they're able to engage effectively, ditto physical health. And then talking a little bit about people's background, how familiar they are with research as a you know, as a general thing. Maybe it feels like something very remote and distant, and that's going to affect how people perceive being involved in the study of any kind. So that could be relevant. Introverts versus extroverts. There's an interesting one. Always going to be a factor, I guess.
I think the point about mental health is really important. So I think, again, going back to the PPIE, so maybe talking to an adult with mental health difficulties, or a parent who's got insight into it, and thinking about how able the child and or the parents will be able to engage in the intervention.
Yeah.
And kind of what considerations, and hopefully the people that are doing this research will kind of have an understanding of that, because
Of course.
but I think showing that you've kind of taken that into account, that it's not, people are going to have days when they may not engage very well, and that you might need to build that into the study.
Yeah, exactly. The idea about communication via diagrams, using more pictures rather than words, is a good idea, because it takes some of the language barrier issues out of the equation. And then, yeah, mediation, just a bit like that. Anything else? Pick up. Are the slides still shared? Oh, yes, PJ.
I think maybe in terms of stigmatization around mental health, religious or beliefs in general could lead to certain words or the way that things have been advertised not being received very well in some communities. They might look at an advert and say, oh, no, we definitely don't have these issues. My children definitely have problems, or the children who might need certain kinds of treatments don't get them because their parents don't believe it's necessary. So it's about like wording and advertising how you decide to describe your kinds of treatments and your services that the NHS can provide to.
So which protected characteristics or sort of other characteristics would that relate to, do you think?
I think religion and belief to some extent, because a lot of these views might stem from the religious upbringing ideas.
Okay, so maybe people with certain upbringings that may, just to summarize for the benefit of those who probably can't hear online, there may be stigma against feeling or being perceived to join something at this kind of intervention, just because it's a sort of it's a tacit admission that you are part of the group that it's targeting, therefore that there are issues there in the first place. Is that summarising? But
you can also include in that rather than just protected characteristics, just someone's experience. So they
Sure.
might have had a negative experience, and so
Yeah.
that will influence.
Yeah,
And
it's
as a
complicated.
parent having a negative experience that then limits your child's access to
sure.
the services.
Yeah, no, so the 9 protected characteristics are clearly a good starting point, but they're far from the whole story, and there's a lot of considerations to take into account. And I think, again, you know, Poonam was alluding to the fact that you can't, it's very difficult to be perfect about this, right? I don't think the ideal equality impact assessment or the ideal study really exists. It's just trying to take as many of these things into account as early as possible so that they can be built into the design of the study. Anything else anyone wants to pick up?
We talked a bit about how like practical ways that you could kind of actions that you could help. So things like travel expenses, or vouchers, or as you said about the digital poverty, kind of buying people kind of periods of internet access if they don't have it, etc.
Sure.
think things like that are kind of
Yeah.
helpful.
So that's good. That's moving into the last column. Are there any other kind of useful mitigations we talked about? Yeah, so paying for travel, perhaps, reimbursing people. We've talked about providing mediators, translations, ensuring that information sheets are intelligible. Any other sort of mediations or actions might be needed in any of these areas?
We mentioned flexibility in terms of the intervention, whenever you're doing it, might be outside of working hours.
Right, so being flexible to fit things in around people, yeah. Right. Okay, so we've covered a lot more than there was in the actual EIA that we're which is good, right? And this is another good thing is you get a large group of people together and you sort of thrash some of these things out, and of course lots of these things are relevant to lots of study. So move on. Okay, we've had the interlude. So this is the actual submission. As I said, we don't necessarily hold this up as a perfect example, but I think just to sort of show what went in. So geographical location, it's written down as potentially positive because they're conducting the research across multiple sites, but the fact is that some people are still going to have a relevant hospital near to them than others. So, but there's also the delivery of interventions remotely, which does to some extent potentially mitigate geographical location specifically, insofar as other things are not a factor as well. Age, they didn't pick up on anything particularly to age. I don't think we've discussed anything particularly related to age, so we can maybe put no known impact in there. Disability, they've put potentially positive because this is the this is the target group. I think that's fair as long as it's done it's done effectively and sensitively. Interventions can be delivered remotely. People don't need to physically attend, and they also have specific co-applicants. I've masked out names, but they have specific co-applicants on the grant who were tasked with making sure that this works well altogether. Gender reassignment, they didn't pick up on anything. Marriage and civil partnership, ditto, especially because it's for children. Pregnancy and maternity, likewise. Ethnicity, so there are picked up on a few bits of data here, and which I think are interesting. So they talked about disproportionate increase in seeking interventions for anxiety and depression amongst minority ethnic groups. So they call this potentially negative because of ethnic inequalities in access to mental health treatment and outcomes in the UK. There's data on that they've explicitly cited here. And they've also done some pilot work which have suggested that they might be able to get an increase in access to services by minority ethnic groups if self-referral is permitted rather than going out and actively seeking people. So they talk about reducing stigma, which we've touched on a little bit, and they're trying to make it easier for people to self-refer themselves into the study and to try and follow up some of this pilot work that they've done to maybe try and mitigate some of the stigma. And perhaps if people maybe discuss things internally, amongst themselves, and then they say, okay, well, we feel a little bit happier about, being involved, and then they bring themselves forward, that may work better. So I don't know details about the pilot work, so I don't know exactly how that works, but that's something that they have at least gone out to try and learn about. And I think, that's definitely going above and beyond what most people might have done previously. So they talk about measures to ensure recruitment is fair, reflects the population, and again, they mention specific people who are tasked with doing these things, which I think is a good practice. It gives you some accountability in terms of how you deal with some of these issues. They don't give any known impact of religion or belief, although perhaps that could be similar to the ethnicity one or related. Sex, likewise. Sexual orientation, not so much. And then socioeconomic status, we've picked up on a little bit. So access to IT, which we've discussed. And in general, participants from lower SES brackets are less likely to participate in clinical trials by observation. And again, there's information, or there's literature on this because of financial barriers and what they call low health literacy. So again, sort of familiarity perhaps with research in general, or a general sense of how, what the benefits might be, perhaps. Okay, so I think we'll summarize with a few takeaway messages, and then we've got a few minutes for questions, and then I think we've got the open session afterwards. You're well spoken to follow up with questions there. So self-awareness and reflection, in some ways we can improve our cultural competency. So I think hopefully the process of thinking about this thing, giving you a little bit of space to sort of discuss it amongst yourselves, is a useful exercise in itself, just because these sorts of things can be a bit of an afterthought. And I think just sort of, thinking about these things and discussing them can be useful. It is increasingly important to funders, and I think this trend is only going to continue, that consideration is given to equitable access to research. I think the days of being able to take just convenient samples, i.e., studying children of your friends or your colleagues and stuff like that, maybe not really going to fly. Obviously it depends on the context how important it is to have a representative sample a little bit. Not everything is a clinical trial, but clearly we need to do better, think more about these things. Equality impact assessments can provide a framework to consider recruitment or methodology decisions. As I said, I don't think necessarily you'll be expected in submitting a grant application or something similar to provide one in this sort of very structured format, but it does give you a framework that you can work with. Okay, so I think that's our last slide. So we'll take any questions jointly that you might have. Hope this has been useful. Thank you both.
Now, can I ask a question?
Yes.
There was a reference in, or to both of you actually, there's a reference in one of the slides to changes in how you write or talk about ethnicity, so not using BAME or BME. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that and where we can find resources. So, for example, I've got a multi-centre study with some colleagues in the States, and we're obviously reporting ethnicity in the patients, and we have lots of problems because the terms in America and Australia and here are very different.
Yeah.
So we just want to make sure that could be helpful to know if that's changed.
I think there's definitely a difficulty, like you said, in America. I think they tend to use people of colour a lot. It is kind of a term that we are using here, but it's still not fully adopted. There's been a lot of research done in this area where they've actually gone out and spoken to different kinds of people to see exactly what they would prefer, I guess, people from these groups. And again, there's no agreement. I think looking at kind of what other sort of funders and people in this area like Wellcome, I think they're tending to use sort of racially minoritized. That tends to be maybe kind of a bit more of an accepted term. I think the government actually have a paper out saying something about why we no longer use BAME. So that again has a bit more detail, but I can send some papers out or some
That's
out
helpful.
that'll have that. But it isn't really an agreed area. And I think everyone has different views on what they would prefer. I think I would say as well, if you're working on specific groups within the sort of race or ethnicity, then use those terms. I think that would be probably the preferred. So if you're working with Black people, say Black people. It's okay to say that. It's not discriminatory. Yeah, I think that would probably be the absolute preferred, but racially minoritized is a pretty good term.
Only that, like with everything else, language in EDI changes, a lot, and it's. I know it can feel a little dizzying, sometimes to try and keep up with the changes in language, but things do shift quite a bit. But there is good advice out there. Funders, where funders require these kind of things, they usually do provide guidance on some of the stuff. And the government does also have quite a few good pages, which can be useful as a general. If the government's approach in the way that it uses language is usually fairly well considered. And so it's not a bad place to start.
I guess so my next question was going to be in terms for the ECRs, if they do want to, and they should be writing this kind of thing in their grant applications or project applications, are there any resources they can use from within the BRC or within ICH more widely if they want some help with kind of making sure that their projects are inclusive?
I know that there's a toolkit, I think it's by one of the other NHR kind of East Midlands. They've actually gotten equality impact assessment toolkit, which is really quite useful, so
Okay.
we can send that out.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Within kind of ICH and gosh,
Not really specifically.
Yeah.
This is quite new to us as well, so we're still working out as well. And I think if there are particular things that people think would be useful, we're happy to hear from you. So get in touch with either of us.
Maybe, John, it's something, at the chalkboards when we're reviewing projects
Yeah.
departmentally, is maybe something we should have as a question that's considered.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
we want
that's a good
to,
point.
as an institution, be more
Yeah, that's a
inclusive.
good point. That's a good idea.
We could kind of have as someone ask the question at the end, kind of. Particularly for obviously clinical research projects, a little bit more than basic science projects.
Did you have a question?
On resources, it's not really a question. This is a little bit touched on, but Genomics England also acknowledge that this is a problem. They have like a diverse data project that
Right.
they're working on, which is like looking at equity in different racial groups, which is going to be interesting when it comes out.
Okay. Genomics England, that is. Okay. For the benefit of those who are online.
There's also a group that Lynn Chitty was working with, and I can't remember the name of them. It's like an initiative to increase, what's it called? To increase inclusion of underrepresented groups in research.
it had an acronym and I can't remember.
Yeah, we must find it out more. So can you try and find out?
Yeah.
Because I remember this. I think it's an NIHR initiative, and you basically, if you're putting in any kind of project where you'll be recruiting people, you can kind of contact them and you can work with them to help develop the inclusivity of projects.
Do you mean the include framework? That's something different.
No, there's some other initiative that she was involved with.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
There is include, yeah.
It went in the BRC application. Remember, it's in the application. Have a look.
Donna?
So just a quick question, kind of related. So obviously at GOSH, we're working with rare patient groups. How do you try and increase inclusivity where you're limited with the people that have the disease?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think you have, there's only so much you can do. Like I say, a perfect project, a perfect equality impact assessment doesn't exist. But I think, just like in the video, it said we wouldn't have useful information on the genetic basis of sickle cell disease if we'd focused on European descended participants, because that's a disease that primarily affects those of African heritage. I don't think you have to have everybody involved in every study. You just have to think about whether there are things that you're doing that are getting in the way of certain groups. So I don't think one has to say, if we can't say that we're sort of balanced with regard to some reasonable baseline in 9 dimensions, then we're doing things wrong. It's just a process of thinking through, are there barriers in the way that don't need to be there?
I think even for rare diseases, it's often the parents who have the money and the resources to come.
I think that's part of the problem. So that was going to be my next question. I mean, whenever a lot of the research here is looking at cell and gene therapies, which are going to be exorbitantly expensive and out of reach for the vast majority of people in our healthcare systems.
Sure.
Then how do we, obviously we're not going to address it. How do we think about that at an early stage?
That's where it's kind of almost, you have to sort of start early on when you're thinking about your research, is really getting people involved from the very beginning, and not maybe that kind of as an afterthought. It's kind of almost co-creating it with them to think about, okay, what are the issues they're facing and how can we do that at every stage of the kind of the research process. That's what I meant in terms of when you think about your stakeholder group, your research team, how diverse are they as well, because they'll come with different perspectives that they'll be able to sort of help with as well. But then of course it can be difficult. You can't, like I think like Jon said, it can't be perfect.
I think that's where it's kind of perfect for early career researchers to start thinking about it as earlier in your career as possible, because then that'll drive everything going forward.
Yeah. But of course, costs come down. I mean, things start super expensive. That's always the way, right? They come down over time. There's enough demand. Lots of things are still going to stay expensive, but it's something to consider. But again, it's that you don't have. It doesn't have to be a deal breaker, but it has to be something to consider. So I noticed Bing Wang's dropped a couple of links in the chat. So maybe we can pass those on as well. Let's see for those.
Any other questions online? If not, I think there's more refreshments or maybe the same refreshments. On offer later. Downstairs, so we can maybe continue the conversation downstairs. Just wanted to finish by thanking everyone that came online, in person and online, and especially anybody who came from the partner sites. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing series. The next bite-sized seminar series will be towards the end of June. So if you can keep an eye on the website and also in your emails for kind of advertisements of that, and tell everyone else to please come along as well. And we'll try not to make it clash with other things. And also, I guess, guys, you're happy if you receive any questions over email.
Yeah, absolutely.
So any follow-ups, please just get in touch either through BRC or the junior faculty team or directly. So, yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.